Hello again. This is now the fifth lecture in the series Philosophy and Coaching, and today we're going to talk about political philosophy and coaching. I want to start though by recapping, first of all, about the objectives of the course as a whole, and say something about where I hope we have got so far. The objectives of the lectures are to help coaches and their clients to think more clearly about some of the big philosophical questions which we and our clients all periodically wonder about as we strive to enjoy and endure life as best we can. And especially, I want to help people with questions such as, why are we here? Who are we? How should we live? Individually and collectively? What should our goals be? How should we relate to various types of things other than ourselves, especially various kinds of other people? Is death the end? How should we prepare for it? How should we respond to the death and dying of others? Those are the big questions. But our fundamental interest, though these questions are, as I say, the big philosophical questions, is practical. We want to know how to live well in the interval between birth and death, i.e., we want to know what good and worthwhile lives considered as a whole consist in, and how to prosecute such lives as best we can. This is moral philosophy, the study of values, and sometimes also known as ethics. And to answer questions in moral philosophy, as in other areas, we need to know the facts about the world and the nature of the persons who inhabit it. For much of this, we look to the sciences. But for some crucial questions, we need to go beyond science or physics into what is appropriately called metaphysics. Especially this is true of questions such as, is this all there is? And one which is especially relevant in the context of addiction, to what extent, if any, do we have free will to choose between alternative possible futures for ourselves and for others? So why do coaches need to attend to these big issues? Well, we and our clients all think about them some of the time, and the answers we accept of them, usually unreflectingly, affect everything else we do. So we will be more effective in our lives and our work if we have thought about why we are doing what we are doing, and don't just accept unquestioningly the received conventional wisdom, even that of alleged experts. It's also worthwhile studying philosophy, the philosophical side of things, because it's always good to be clear and honest about what we are talking about and how much we do and don't know, so that we are not cowed by currently orthodox dogma or seduced into dangerous muddles by plausible rhetoric. But this lecture is about politics, which is not, for most of us and most of our clients, a big issue, at least as usually understood. However, I'm understanding here the study of politics in a broad sense as being about everything which groups of people do together to formulate and try to achieve collective goals. And this does concern us all, especially coaches. The groups may be as small as a family or as large as the whole of humanity, with in between groups such as nations and neighborhoods, companies and teams of various sorts, as well as mutual support groups. These groups may come together for diverse purposes, notably the pursuit of safety, prosperity, health, and happiness. Coaches and their clients are parts of such groups, and so need to understand how they can, should, or must relate to them in the pursuit of living well and doing good. Now, politics, in the broad sense, is simply about power. It only occurs in relation to questions. It not only occurs in relations to questions about the making and enforcing of laws, it occurs whenever relationships involve one or more people exercising power to try to get one or more other people to behave in ways other than they would choose to behave, but for the successful exercise of power. But there are many ways of getting others to do what they would otherwise not choose to do. And so there are many overlapping ways of exercising power. Coaches need to think carefully about what kind of power it is appropriate for them to employ with their clients under what circumstances. They also need to be aware that clients exercise many types of power over them, some legitimate, some which they, the coaches, need to resist. Coaches also need to be aware of the great danger of exchanging addiction to, say, drugs for addiction to power, i.e., control freakery. Now, as I say, there are many forms of power. The exercise of power to get people to do what they would not spontaneously choose to do is various. Amongst the most important forms of power that coaches need to understand, exercise, or respond to are, first, forcing. That's using physical violence or the threat of it to make people do what we want them to do. And that is indeed how laws are enacted and imposed in order to cause obedience to them. It's not usually very appropriate in relations such as the coaching one, or indeed a marital relationship. Then there is incentivizing people, that is, offering them rewards or sanctions if they do what we want them to do and not what they would otherwise spontaneously do. And many of these rewards and sanctions involve money. This is especially obvious in commercial transaction. But then there is manipulative power, exercising power by manipulating people. And what does this involve? Well, it mainly involves the use of various forms of deception, of trying to get people to do what you want them to do while believing that either you or they are actually doing something else. Then there is getting people to do what you want them to do by persuading them. That is, by using arguments. But notice that you may persuade people with bad arguments as well as with good ones, as politicians know very well. And the last one that I want to mention, though this is by no means an exhaustive list, is making use of anticipated reaction. This is the exercise of reactional power as exercised by voters and consumers. And it's very important because it's not very well understood. What it means, reactional power, is that I do something which I otherwise wouldn't do because of what I think, perhaps wrongly, you will do unless I do this. In other words, to take an example, a teacher walks into a classroom and all the children stand up. Why do they stand up? Because they think they will get into trouble if they don't, or possibly that they will be praised if they do. Now, it may be that the teacher is not one of those teachers who particularly likes formal environments, would prefer the children just to be getting on with whatever they're doing, either concentrating on their own activities or chatting to each other or whatever. But in fact, the structure of the particular school is such that there's a convention that students stand up when teachers come into the room. Well, similarly in politics, politicians, if they are democratically elected to their offices, are constantly compelled to conform their behavior to what they think their electorates want them to do, or at least will tolerate them doing, because otherwise in the next election they'll be voted out of office. Now, politicians may get it quite wrong. Namely, they may do things which they think the electorate will like, but the electorate doesn't like it and votes them out of office because of it. However, unless we understand the power of anticipated reactions, we will tend to oversimplify the exercise of power and think it only applies to the first form, or perhaps the first and second forms, that is, forcing people to do things or incentivizing them to do things. Now, ideally, coaches like teachers and doctors will actually be in the business of empowering their clients, but only empowering them to use appropriate forms of power so as to act prudently in their own interests and benignly in the interests of others. They will also, in a sense, be disempowering themselves so that their clients no longer need them. And in this, they are like teachers and doctors who will have been successful when their clients say to them, or when they can say to their clients, you no longer need my services. And that, of course, is an impressive but difficult feat for any professionals to perform. Now, coaches need something to know about the narrower conception of politics. The question of how I should live and what I should strive for may, for many clients, be answered by reference only to enjoying what we discussed earlier, namely good personal relationships and engaging in absorbing, worthwhile, and adequately rewarded work, including service to others. It may also, the question, how should I live, be answered by various forms of renunciation of the pursuit of worldly success and committing oneself primarily to the pursuit of private spiritual goods, such as serenity or enlightenment. But for most people, and many coaches, as well as their clients, answering the question, how should I live, will also involve quite strong, even if largely latent, political conviction, i.e. strong intuition about what's fair and unfair, and a strong sense of justice and injustice. You and they will also probably have strong views about whether their own society is a just one, whether they see themselves as beneficiaries or victims of injustice, and what they think about their obligations in relation to the injustices in society. For example, by offering free coaching to the poor. In relation to injustice more generally, you and they may not be only trying to live so as to further your political ideal. You and they may also be willing sometime to fight, to kill, and even to die for them. So the stakes in politics are pretty high. Now, this is the way things used to be when they were much less problematic. Throughout most of history in most societies, political beliefs and values were unproblematic for the teachers, healers, and spiritual advisors who tried to help people to live good or better lives in the same way that modern coaches do. What constituted a good life was laid down by religious authority, and it was the business of rulers to ensure that everybody was encouraged, enabled, or compelled to live a good life as defined by that authority. Moreover, since society was hierarchical, what constituted the kind of life you could and should live was largely determined by accidents of birth, about where you found yourself in the pecking order of society as a result of the family into which you were born. Your duty then was to love, honor, and obey God, or the gods, as well as the lords and monarchs whose right to rule over you were more or less explicitly divinely endorsed. And in return for your obedience, divine as well as human rulers would protect and promote your interests in this life, and especially after your death. Well, things are very different today. We no longer, here in South Africa and in most of the rest of the world, outside the Middle East and China, it should be said, but elsewhere, we mostly all recognize, no longer anymore all recognize a single authority, religious or political, about how people ought to live their lives. Nor do we accept the legitimacy of hierarchy and that wealth and power should be inherited, acquired through other accidents of birth like gender or ethnicity. But having said that, what we all reject in the traditional way of deciding on values. Having said that, we need to recognize that we all have very different and often conflicting ideas about how people ought to live, i.e., about what is right and wrong, moral or immoral behavior, and also about how and by whom we should be governed. Now, where these views come from are our beliefs and decisions about how to live well, i.e. our fundamental moral and political values, don't just arrive in our brains from nowhere, and we don't work them all out for ourselves once and for all when we become teenagers. We acquire our beliefs and values from the societies in which we live and what we are taught as children in families and in school. We also modify and hopefully increase our understanding of how best to live our lives as individuals and in groups from experience and reflection throughout our life. But so do our clients, whose political and moral beliefs and values may differ from our own because so many traditional views about morals and politics now seek to coexist side by side. Now, this leads to the problem of pluralism. We are all, as professionals, as clients, as individuals and citizens, confronted with the problem of pluralism. We have strongly held beliefs about justice and therefore about politics and public morality, which we know many others disagree with. And we have strong beliefs about personal morality, how we should behave, perhaps urge others to behave, such as our children, especially in relation to sex, to money, and to supporting political causes. So how should we treat those who disagree with us and who do not conform to our conception of justice? Well, there's an easy answer to this, namely that we should be tolerant. Most political disagreements nowadays are couched in terms of whether the values of the so-called permissive capitalist West, all of those words in inverted commas, are to be applauded or deplored. Some coaches and some clients will find themselves on opposite sides in such debates between so-called Western and champions of Western values, so-called, and their critics. Typically, though, this won't matter in helping people to recover from addiction or escape depression and anxiety. As with differences about religious belief, the coach will be concerned only to understand and assist, not to convert. Coaches, at least, if not their clients, will, however, need to endorse the principle of tolerance of, respect for, and even enthusiasm about different understandings of the truth about the world and how best to live in it. Such tolerance of diverse views is, in fact, what has underpinned all progress in politics and morals, as well as in science. Science made progress once people started doubting authorities and allowing other people to doubt authorities and hold conflicting and competing views which needed to be tested by experiment and experience in order to make progress. Well, the same is true about moral progress and political progress, such as we have made, for example, in no longer typically having religious wars such as those that disfigured much of the world throughout most of its history. Similarly, we no longer accept the values of imperialist domination. Whatever we think the benefits of imperialism may or may not, and indeed the cruelties imposed by imperialism may or may not have been. I think more obviously we no longer believe that children who steal because they're hungry should be hanged, nor indeed that people should be tortured in order to get them to change their religious allegiances. So in all sorts of ways, we have made progress in morals and politics through tolerance and coaches at least need to endorse that view. And it's not particularly difficult because everybody pretty much agrees about one basic moral and political doctrine, which is most easily labeled humanism. So both coaches and clients, whether or not they're defenders of Western values, will need to share the fundamental humanist principle, whether or not it's based on religious conviction. This is the principle that is always good and morally right to relieve pointless suffering if we can, and to enhance our own and other people's harmless enjoyment of life before death. This is one reason why it's so difficult to help addicts who have become completely indifferent to the effects of their conduct on the suffering and happiness of others. They need to recover their basic humanity if they are to rejoin the human race. But in fact, this basic humanist principle of relieving suffering and enhancing human enjoyment underpins the politics and ethics of all societies known to us, ancient and modern, African, Asian, European, North and South American, and Australasian. The political consequence of humanist morality is that we all agree in believing or in trying to secure for our societies the political goods of safety, prosperity, freedom, and justice. Where we differ is that though we all share these same basic humanist principle of minimizing suffering and maximizing happiness, we differ on the following: on how best to achieve this, on whether more is required by morality than this humanist principle. For example, does morality require us to cultivate piety? We disagree on whether other goods are or should be aimed at by political activity. For example, should political activity be aimed at achieving national glory or greatness? Should we be trying to make America great again? On what should we disagree? Sorry, there's another thing that we disagree on. What should we do when principles conflict? When the principle of liberty conflicts with the principle of safety, or the principle of justice conflicts with the good of prosperity. And finally, we disagree on whose well-being we should care most about. Should we care about everybody's well-being equally, or should we put our families and loved ones first? But in the coaching relationship, as in the marital relationship, differences on these issues don't prevent the relationship from flourishing. Coaching relationships can flourish despite substantial disagreements about moral and political issues. But there is, it seems to me, a very difficult question for coaches, to which, frankly, I don't know the answer. This is the fact that so much politics today is identity politics and an associated politics of victimhood. The difficult political problems in the coaching relationship arise when the answers people give to the questions, who am I and what are my rights, are cast in terms of belonging to some category of person who have been wrongfully oppressed because of their race, gender, religion, sexuality, social class, etc. This causes problems because, first, it's clearly inappropriate for coaches to challenge the accuracy of these self-identifications as victims of people who are victims whose rights have been violated. It's not for us to challenge people's right to believe that they are victims whose rights have been violated. But this sense that our clients have, that they are victims whose rights have been violated, may lead to a foundering of the whole coaching process itself, or the whole treatment process, because the client will claim, you can't understand because you're not a man or woman, You're not black or white or gay or straight or poor or rich. And if the client believes that the nature of their identity makes it impossible for you, who perhaps have a different identity, to understand them, it's very difficult to see how you can work around that in the coaching relationship to get fruitful, constructive communication going. And secondly, it's difficult to deal with the identity issues of those who perceive themselves to be victims, because in fact, it may give them a permanent excuse for taking no responsibility for what has happened to them in the past, and therefore acquiring no insight on what they need to do differently in the future. So I conclude with a painful truth. I personally have never been able to offer any real help of any sort, material or psychological, to people who are convinced that everything that has gone wrong in their life has been entirely down to other people or to circumstances beyond their control, and never down to themselves, even in part. I find this especially true, and indeed distressing, of the poor and those who, with the best, and those who have the best reasons for complaining about their circumstance, the real victims of circumstances beyond control, such as the victims of trauma and abuse in childhood. It deeply saddens me and makes me feel helpless myself that I know of no way of getting through to these people the notion that they can still help themselves. They have not been rendered helpless. So if you know of any way of dealing with this issue, I'd be glad to hear from you. Thank you very much. That is the end of lecture 5.
Thank you. Okay, so I've just unmuted Keith, who's joined us from New York, and welcome, Keith. Thank you very much.
Right, let me see if I can get back into so you can see me.
I can see
you. What do I need to do?
I can see you very clearly, Peter.
Yeah, you can see me.
Oh, yes,
I can see you.
I see you quite debonair sitting there, and thank you very much for your chat and your talk. It was very broad, but yet very deep. So
thank you for that.
Yeah, appreciate that. So I guess, the existential questions, who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Are really very much at the heart of this philosophical inquiry. And, I don't think, I think we spend our whole lives asking those questions and yet never finding the answer. And certainly your lecture providing the juxtaposition of understanding all of those particular questions as they relate to group formation and socialization and sociological concerns or political concerns or cultural concerns is very clear and well put. So I appreciate that as well. I think the more demanding questions are, and this is perhaps a question for you in light of the discussion around coaching. Do you believe then that perhaps the existential crisis that might evolve out of addiction, out of poverty, out of loss, such as the loss of a family member or a spouse, something along that line, that those might be the pivotal breaking point, the gap, the holes in the soul, if you will, that then propel someone, move someone to make a change.
Well, I like that expression, holes in the soul. I certainly think that people become addicts because they wish to escape from some form of painful reality. And one of the reasons that they relapse is because having for a time got out of painful reality, especially into such a safe place as a rehab or whatever, they then return to a reality which is indeed still very painful. And moreover, my view is that actually the human situation is a pretty painful one. It's not only painful, but it is painful. If if you look realistically at what it's like to be a human being, there is much suffering to be observed. And so it's not surprising that people want to, at best, avert their gaze from these realities, but also to find ways of escape from the painfulness of it. However, I do think that part of the healing process, which coaches and others are involved in, involves encouraging people to consider whether this bleak but realistic view of the human condition is only one side of the story, that there is in fact much that they can still find, which will give them a strong sense of who they are, and particularly not just who they are, but why they matter in the world. One of the things I think that depresses us about the human condition is we think there's so the difference we can make to the world is so vanishingly small and transitory that there's virtually no point in trying. And I think one can actually reverse that depressing view of the world, and seeing that however small it is, however small the way in which we can make the world a slightly better place, can be a source of immense fulfillment and satisfaction, and indeed revelation, such that we no longer need the ways of escape on which we have hitherto been relying, including our various addictions. Not sure whether that exactly answers your question.
Well,
but
I
it
think
certainly,
it does.
the thoughts that your question provoked.
Yeah, I think it does to a certain extent. And I've talked to David about this before, and, you know, the whole idea of trauma. And, you know, we're in a trauma-based society, and certainly the world is, whether or not it's implicit or explicit, whether or not it's vicarious or, explicitly realized through some act, you know, be it violence on TV or be it violence against the person in some way or another. And I wonder, you know, everything you say is fine from a prefrontal cortex viewpoint, from a from a cognitive viewpoint, right? I mean, if your executive function is working, your mind is smart, and you're thinking, you know, perhaps then you can rationalize or you can put together one cogent thought and another. But I really do believe that many people are just scattered about trying to just exist. You know, as you said, there's so much suffering, and, you know, just survival is so important. And, you know, just stepping up and stepping out is so important. I wonder from the trauma viewpoint, if you're not dealing with trauma, you know, then I somehow believe that if you don't deal with your trauma, it doesn't matter how much, you know, talk therapy you might have. If you're not dealing with it on a body level, then you're not able to take responsibility or even see that you have responsibility, agency for your own life. Many people don't think they have agency at all.
Yes, I think, I mean, the question of trauma, we talked a bit about last week. I mean, I think it is important to understand as realistically as possible the harms you have suffered, particularly those in early life. But equally, it's important not to wallow in them. That is not to say, well, what can you expect of me given that all this happened to me? What can I do? My situation is hopeless. The trick, which I agree is a difficult one for both coaches and clients, is to be realistic and honest about and intelligent about traumatic events in earlier life, particularly, but also to be realistic and honest and intelligent about how one can move beyond that. Well, how one can see it in context. I mean, you know, there are sort of banal things that one can usually say without, as it were, minimizing the client's trauma. But it is a fact, probably in most cases, that at least they weren't kidnapped and sold into slavery or made into child soldiers somewhere in Africa. You know, there are I think it's healthy to see one's own traumas and that of other people in the context of you
Right.
know,
So
the world
there's certainly a way to minimize the comparative despair, if you will. But I do believe that unless the individual is really focused in on what their traumas are and what they were, and then maybe has an opportunity to accept them and then forgive them, you know, through this acceptance.
Yeah.
And then move on from there. They can't really take, to your point, they hold them and they guard them as their precious battle wounds. You know, so as I always say, God moves mountains, but you have to bring the shovel.
Yes, I think the word forgiveness is the crucial one there. I think the phrase I used last week about this was taken from a poem by W.H. Auden about Sigmund Freud. It's about becoming rational and reconciled to one's past traumatic experiences. And I think that's a good one, a good phrase. You know, the dangers, particularly for addicts, I think, as is fairly well known, is that it's very easy to fall into the trap of excessive self-pity and a tendency to blame other people for everything that may have gone wrong.
Sure.
I mean, I'm not just talking about the traumatic experience, but everything in one's life that has gone wrong.
Sure.
You know, it is not to be, as it were, attributed wholly to the traumatic events and not at all to any characterological failings one may be responsible for oneself or have been responsible for.
Well, as we know, our version of reality is very faulty. Just as our memory and our ability to piece together events, and oftentimes it's very much colored by you know, where we were at that particular point in our emotional development. So you know, it's a very faulty machine, and I do believe that you can rewire it and rewire it by at least allowing yourself at a certain point in life to cognitively think of the other people who were involved and perhaps their histories.
Yeah.
Perhaps also, in light of that, provide some compassion that allows you to move past. Yes,
this reminds me of Philip Larkin's rather improper poem, which I hope you won't mind if I quote briefly.
Oh, please, if it's improper, even more so.
They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn. And so it goes on.
Oh, good.
Now, he concludes that the answer is to get out as soon as you can and never have children of your own. but my response to that is, they fuck you up, your sons and daughters. They may not mean to, but they do. All sacrifice they take for granted and blame their sorrows all on you.
That's very good.
They'll have children in their turn.
Yeah, that's Philip Larkin. Is that what you said?
Well, I conclude that actually, so everyone must forgive everyone else.
Uh-huh. Oh, good. Yeah, his term was "they mess you up." By the way. No, that's not. But then I do see the one, "they fuck you up," your mom and dad. That's great. I have to read that one. Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, they may not mean to, but they do.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'll have to pass that on.
Well, it's in Philip Larkin's collected poems.
I see it. I just
called "This Be the Day." You can Google it. It's printed in full.
Yeah, no, I haven't. And then, of course, and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens.
That's right.
Yourself. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids of yourself. I love that. Very good. From high windows. Very good.
Oh,
very good. Well, thank you for that. I'm not in short supply. I could talk forever about philosophy.
Well, I hope we will get a chance to talk again at some stage.
Oh, I would love that. I'd love that. And thank you so much, David, for making this happen. I've seen your other talks as well, Peter, but I haven't been able to make it live. So here we are. So thank you.
Good. Well, very nice to meet you online.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you so much.
Wonders of technology.